to push up the priority of workers in terms of redundancy legislation in liquidation circumstances. And if you were on this side of the House in the opposition benches, you'd be kicking and screaming about that. But now that you're in government, you've put forward an amendment that kicks the can down the road for another year. So we already have a wait of 6 years, and you propose to extend it to 7. And yet you've just said that you've no intentions of it taking another year. Then amend your amendment and tell us how long it is going to take to change the legislation, to bring workers in this country who are victims of liquidations, sometimes and often tactical liquidations by companies who buy up companies who buy up companies and want to ditch the legacy of those workers. When you are going to bring that legislation up to speed with countries like France, Portugal, Greece, to name a few, who put workers first in those type of liquidation situations. And that's what the Debenhams dispute has been about. It's about justice, it's about fairness, and it is really about recognising the role of workers in all of that happens in society, whether it's running a shop, running a hospital, running a school, running a public transport service. And it's so ironic that they managed to run a strike during the entire pandemic when what was shown to everybody was that workers matter. Their lives and their jobs and their effort and their labours are at the heart of everything that functions in society. And the pandemic showed us that very, very clearly when we came to rely on the efforts of essential workers just to keep the basics of society going. So I don't think that it's good enough for you to put in this amendment and to kick the can down the road and then to say to us, I don't intend it to be that slow. If you don't intend it to be that slow, then tell us you're bringing your own bill before the Dail next week, like a good Fianna Fáil opposition backbencher would have done back in the day. But now that you're in the comfortable position of being a junior or a second minister, you're kicking it down the road. If it's not 12 months, then don't put 12 months into the amendment. It just does not make sense. In addition to all that's been said about this dispute, I want to make a couple of points. You see, in your response, you say that you've been very good about making sure that workers knew what their welfare entitlements and their supports were and that they received their statutory redundancy. Well, I've got news for you. They're not entitlements that are handed down by you or Leo Varadkar or anybody else. They're entitlements that are there for every citizen in the state. The redundancy pot that is there for the statutory redundancy they were paid was funded by them. Many of them over 20, 30 years of service when they paid their full social welfare contributions into the social insurance fund. They paid for their own statutory redundancy. It was not some gift from the gods of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to hand to them, nor was the knowledge of their welfare entitlements or the supports that they're entitled to now in the prime of their life that they're being dumped on the scrap heap with no other options other than a €3 million fund to go back to school. I never heard anything so insulting to mothers, to grandmothers, to experienced workers, to those who have given most of their lives working in the retail industry, making vast profits for companies. There you are, girls, go back to school. It was a shameful insult. They are voting on it and it's likely it'll be accepted, but it's only because there is nothing else there for them. You have done nothing for them except to tell them what they're legally entitled to, which they knew anyway. I could have told them that as a constituency representative of many of them. So don't insult them by saying you've done everything you can. You, your party and your government were dragged kicking and screaming by those workers into even meeting them and their unions. You were dragged kicking and screaming. Micheál Martin was dragged kicking and screaming because he was ashamed of what the amazing women were doing on the pickets in Patrick Street in Cork. So you've done all that you can, but all that you can is not enough. Because when you compare how those workers have been treated to how banks have been treated, how industry has been treated, how indeed the bailiffs that were on their heels all the time, KPMG, have been treated by this state, it is really quite shocking. Just to wind up Anglo-Irish Bank, which brought this country into a massive collapse, this state paid KPMG $175 million. And then when you delve down into the role of KPMG throughout the fabric of finances and the secret world of banking and finances in this country, they got $11 million to advise us on broadband, a fiasco that ended up costing us more than $3 billion. And they got $11 million for bad advice. They also got millions from banks like AIB, who paid them 50 million for auditing their books between 2002 and 2009. And the audit was so good that they told none of us what was coming down the tracks, that there was about to be a collapse in AIB or indeed in the other banks that they audited. So there's a different set of rules for those who act as bailiffs, even for the security companies who went in the wee hours of the morning and broke into the picket lines with the Garda protection, extraordinary protection of Gardaí on those picket lines. They went in and they pulled women and some men out of those picket lines in a number of stores, and they did that on the basis of the protection of this state. And guess what? We were in level 5 restrictions. Public health pandemic rules were broken, not just by the bailiffs and the security firms, ironically, who we'll be talking about later on and how we're going to regulate them. Them that were regulated, and they were regulated, security firms and bailiffs, actually broke public health guidelines with the collusion of the state forces, with the Garda Commissioner, etc., standing over it, and nothing happened. There's been fines issued up and down this country to ordinary working class people, particularly youths, on the breaches of public health guidelines, but nothing to these companies who broke those guidelines and used their force to remove the pickets. Finally, I just want to say that, you see, Deputy Boyd Barrett and Deputy Barry referred to something earlier on about the role of workers in this. And I note that the Minister says we spoke to the ICTU and we spoke to Mandate and we met them all. And that's fine. And they are the official representatives of workers in this country. But when we say that nothing changes except from below, that is true. Slavery would still be dominant means of trading labour across the globe unless the slaves themselves revolted. Change always comes from below. Women wouldn't have the vote unless women revolted and insisted on the vote. We wouldn't have abortion rights, limited and all as they are in this state, without the big mass movement of Repeal the 8, and I could go on. But in the case of Debenhams, we would not have had resistance of this nature that was persistent, and that shone a light on the injustice to workers, that gave us all a sense of comfort and inspiration that we can actually fight back against an unjust system. We would not have had that without the rank and file workers themselves. Regardless of who you speak to in the official trade union movement, at the end of the day, the people that matter are those men and women who are on the picket lines, the grannies, the mothers, the sisters, who stuck it out through the wee hours of the night, in the cold winter nights, in making sure that the one piece of light, the one piece of armoury they had to shine a light on the injustice, the stock that they protected from being taken from the stores by their persistent picketing, was done by them. Not by ICTU, not by Mandate, not by anybody else. It was done by them. And that is why the recognition of those workers is fundamentally important. But they were dragged into the High Court by previously mentioned KPMG, who this state paid millions and millions to. One of them was humiliated, well, not in her terms humiliated, but they attempted to humiliate her in the High Court and put threats over her behaviour. And think of the resources that are being spent. Court resources, lawyers, Gardaí, being spent to protect a company who's imposing an injustice on these workers. And the reason why it could happen is because, and now I'm talking to a minister whose party was in government since 2015, the other minister's party wasn't, he was in opposition, but yours was. You failed to legislate on the back of the Duffy Cattle report. You commissioned the report. You got them to come out with a view about liquidations and redundancies and the preferential treatment of workers, and then did nothing. You sat in your hands for 6 years almost, and now we're being told that you want to sit in your hands for another year. Well, all I can say is shame on you, and I think that the people of this country really need to know what you're doing. You're kicking down the road for, you know, again and again, the rights of workers. And as we see more and more connived and contrived liquidations taking place in retail, and the young people that everybody's been talked about in the last few days being scrapped and being dumped on the heap of unemployment, then shame on you that you're not prepared to act now. And I'm saying to you, withdraw your amendment and pass this bill today.
Deputy. Now